I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons for the last year or so by now, and I think the game is pretty amazing. Surely, I haven't had much experience or any at all as a player, as I've been essentially enthralled into the role of the Dungeon Master. But I'm fine with it. Being a DM is actually pretty fun. You get to create intricate stories and challenges and amuse yourself seeing how your players end up resolving them. But today I'm not here to talk about Dungeons & Dragons, or at least that's not going to be the main focus of the video. Today I want to talk about F.A.T.A.L. And even if you have little to no experience with D&D, do not worry. Knowledge about D&D in general is not required to understand what this video is about. I'm going to say it now, the content discussed in this video, while it will be heavily censored, so you'll have to fill some gaps with your own imagination in order to abide to YouTube standards and avoid having my channel nuked, is still probably going to be offensive in its nature. Trigger warnings for explicit content, PDF files, and generally disgusting things. So let's start by explaining what is F.A.T.A.L. F.A.T.A.L being not only the name of the game but also an acronym for From Another Time, Another Land, at least in its second edition, is a fantasy tabletop role-playing game. Much like Dungeons & Dragons, it's an RPG that you play with pen and paper and a bunch of dice, simulating and attempting to create a story shaped by the players while still following strict mechanics. With F.A.T.A.L's Alpha Edition being published in the year 2000, its first edition in 2002, and its second edition in 2004, F.A.T.A.L has in fact not seen much success, which is something unsurprising given the nature of the game. And throughout the video, you'll hear me making plenty of comparisons to D&D. Let's start with saying that the creator of F.A.T.A.L had a vision in mind, to create a fantasy tabletop RPG grounded in reality as much as possible, while still having fantasy elements. Because of that, all of the fantasy races from F.A.T.A.L are heavily inspired and as similar as possible to their folkloric counterparts, while other elements such as nutrition, weaponry, and general medieval society rules and laws have all been inspired by a lengthy research into various historical books and documents, including but not limited to the Odyssey of Homer, the History of Punishment and Torture by Farrington, Wage Labor and Guilds in Medieval Europe by Stephen A. Epstein, and Life in Medieval Villages by Francis and Joseph Gies. This essentially goes to say that the creator of F.A.T.A.L, Byron Hall, founder of F.A.T.A.L Games, definitely did his homework on the subject. Byron describes himself as someone who adores gaming and writing, being an avid RPG gamer since 1980. He has taught at the Northern Illinois University, where he earned his MA in Quantitative Research Methods and did pre-doctoral work with structural equation modeling. Basically, this guy's a huge nerd. No disrespect towards the other nerds. I mean, I play D&D, I'm basically a huge nerd myself. So, let's talk about what is probably the core aspect of any RPG around: character creation. Your character is arguably the most important thing within a role-playing game. I mean, it's in the name. You are taking the role of a specific character and playing or acting as if you were it. For those of you that don't know, in Dungeons & Dragons, creating your character is a rather simple process, which I will not explain in its entirety. I'll just go over the simple and most important parts. When creating a character, you decide on a name, gender, and physical aspect. These are all purely for flavor, as they will not affect the game most of the time. Definitely not foreshadowing F.A.T.A.L here. Afterwards, you pick on a race, such as human, orc, elf, and so on, which may give a variety of bonuses depending on the race picked, and then it's time to settle on a class, such as fighter, ranger, wizard, etc. Finally, it's time to allocate your stats: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Those are called ability scores and essentially define whether your character is a strong, burly weightlifting bodybuilder, a charming poet, or an insightful wise dude. And that's essentially it, really. There are other details that I could go over, such as proficiencies, feats, preferred weapons, and starting items, but what I described above is the essential core of creating a character in D&D. So let's talk about F.A.T.A.L character creation. I will also attempt to oversimplify it. Perhaps I should have mentioned earlier that this is in no way a guide that explains and tries to teach you how to play F.A.T.A.L. I simply want to talk about some critical mechanics and aspects of the game in order to highlight how absolutely bonkers this game is. Fatal character creation is similar to the one in Dungeons and Dragons. You settle on a name, race, gender, and then your stats. Races in Fatal include the following: Anakim, Bugbear, Black Dwarf, Brown Dwarf, White Dwarf, Dark Elf, Light Elf, Human, Kobold, Ogre, Cliff Ogre, Grakak Ogre, Kinderfrasser Ogre, Borbitingama Troll, Hill Troll, and Subterranean Troll. Each and every one of these races, according to the author, has been inspired by a different mythical race from medieval folklore, such as Anakims being essentially Cambions, the result of an incubus and a succubus mating with a human. So now that we have a race and a name, it's time to consult the racial hatred chart. Yep, the chart that will determine which races your character will go along well with and which ones it won't. And don't worry, the game also has a pre-prepared list of racial slurs for you to use for maximum roleplay efficiency. The next step for creating a character is deciding on the gender, and trust me when I say that, unlike in Dungeons and Dragons, the gender is a huge decision in Fatal. In fact, depending on whether you are male or female, there are quite some modifiers that will be applied and that will affect your stats later on. Gender modifiers include, but are not limited to, males having a physique strength bonus of plus 30%, with females having a malus of minus 30%. Males have a bodily attractiveness of minus 3%, while females have a plus 3%. Males have a plus 3% bonus to both math and spatial intelligence, while females have a plus 5 and plus 4% bonus to intuition and reflection, wisdom, respectively. Furthermore, the manual details the roles of women within this setting, and I quote, "The natural role of woman regarding childbirth and subsequent motherhood has impacted the societal role of women, such that they are deemed better suited to stay at home, cook, clean, and care for their husband and children. Prior to marriage, maidens are expected to be chaste, though few fulfill this expectation. Once married, a wife is expected to be submissive to her husband, who owns her. Despite the presence of gender norms, it is unwise to consider either gender overall to be superior to the other. Males and females are different and merely better suited for different things. Males are clearly better suited for violence, since violence is the primary cause of shifts in power, and because males are larger than females, it is unsurprising, in fact to be expected, that males have emerged as the dominant gender across the available races. Females are better suited for interpersonal and familial relationships, where their bodily attractiveness, language, intuition, and reflection are most influential and dominant over that of males. Males and females are far from equal. It will be worth mentioning that mostly every single aspect of your character is something that you randomly generate, with the exception being your character's gender, because due to the game's own recommendation, no one should be forced to play as a woman. Well, now that we have decided on a character's race, name, and gender, it is time for probably the most dreadful part of a character's creation in the F.A.T.A.L universe: the body. With an entire chapter dedicated just to your character's physical appearance, trust me when I say the sheer complexity and level of detail you are most definitely not ready for. Starting with the age, which according to manual is something you usually randomly roll for, this will also determine your lifespan depending on your race. Worth noting that females live 1d10% longer than males, regardless of their race. Now, once we have obtained our age, our character will incur something called a lifespan modifier. The lifespan modifier, depending on a character's age category, will affect height and weight, which will also be dependent on the base stats of height, along with its many modifiers depending on the race and gender and weight. With our weight and height rolled and accounted for, it's time to calculate the body mass index, which will determine whether our character is overweight or underweight. And yes, those will affect in-game statistics, and if you thought we were even close to finishing our characters, oh boy. It's time for body part proportions, with different races having different proportions of body parts. We'll have to calculate them according to the following chart depending on our race, and then we roll for other details that will affect our character's status of body attractiveness by randomly rolling for hair color, hair length, skin color, attractiveness, and repulsive features such as hair, eyes, lips, voice, crotch, chest, waist, buttocks, legs, hands and feet, mannerism, and a 1d10 for a cup size. Oh hey, at least this is over now, and it's time to actually play the game. And no, we gotta calculate the hair thickness, and it's type roll a 1d100 and see whether you're balding, curly, oily, straight, wavy. Then proceed to calculate your character's breadth by consulting the chart below along with your vision, facial features, tongue size, and now proceed to roll a d1 100,000, which equals to 6 dice that are 10-sided, to see if your character is a freak of nature, which could potentially make your character have a funnel chest, pigeon chest, be polydactyl, have a supernumerary nipple, or be a hermaphrodite. And guess what? We are not even close to being done. It is now time to calculate your your other features. It's time to calculate the areola diameter and the areola hue, along with the cup size and nipple length, all factors which can and will affect your character's bodily attractiveness. With this being done, it is also time to calculate the lower parts. And by lower parts of a female character, yes, we actually have to calculate the circumference potential and the depth potential. And if you're wondering why would we ever need something like this, well, guess what? No object may be fully inserted into a if it is longer than the female's depth potential. In such extreme situations, internal damage may occur. Oh, and don't worry, if you decide to follow the meta for this game and create a male character, you still have to calculate the circumference potential in order to determine whether your will incur damage if it were to be stretched beyond its limit. Depending on the role, you can calculate an equivalent of what may fit inside, determined by 2 fingers, 3 fingers, a woman's fist, or a man's fist. And of course, and this is going to go really hard for anyone who plays Rust, you will also be required to calculate the length of your. So what kind of in-game mechanics will these calculations and character stats affect? Well, I'm glad you asked. Conditions that your character might be affected with, depending on your stats, might include a ripped orifice, a certain woman's membrane resistance, the likelihood of a pregnancy, which is calculated by a load count, randomly rolled by using a 1d100, with a load of 80 million or less being insufficient for having a child. It is also worth noting that every load attempt within a 24-hour period incurs cumulative penalties of -30 to the load check. God, I would like to say that with this we are completely done, but we are not. And to spare you from the rest of the process, I will simply list the remaining traits that need to be randomly rolled or calculated for our characters, such as foot size, fist circumference, handedness, head circumference, allergies, resistance to intoxication, diseases which may include cancer, chickenpox, the common cold, diabetes, encephalitis, influenza, measles, leprosy, muscular dystrophy, rabies or Tourette syndrome, and it is only now that we start calculating the stats that D&D players might be familiar with, such as strength, intelligence, and so on, by consulting these very simple charts to determine how things such as our physique, reaction speed, agility, rhetorical, hand-eye coordination, enunciation, math, spatial intuition, common sense, and reflection will be affected. And this is it. We have finished. Our character is completed. It's what I'd like to say. Unfortunately, we are barely halfway through, as guess what? Everything we've done so far, we did nothing but create our character's body. It is now time to flesh out their mind, their beliefs, their morals, which is done by a system involving piety points, ethical disposition, systems of ethics and morals, dimension of morality, dimension of immorality, temperament, mental illness, society, your character's birthday, birth status, which social class they belong to, preferences and customs, and with this we are finally done. We have our fully fledged character ready to play with, and if the character's creation process wasn't enough to make you realize just how insane this game is, I will proceed to read for you random entries from the rulebook, which I found either particularly amusing or particularly disturbing. Starting with crime and punishment, it should be obvious that even in this universe, the law is something that exists, and depending on the race or society your character belongs to, the punishment will wildly differ from one another. We could talk about adultery, arson, assault, and blasphemy, but the one I personally found to be the funniest is the crime of failure to pay rent, which in Dark Elf society is punished by having once found guilty of such crimes to be beaten up to death by their immediate family. I'm not even kidding, you could create an entire campaign around this single prospect, where you and your buddies could roleplay as a bunch of Dark Elf roommates doing all kind of random stuff in an attempt to pay rent each month, with the campaign's final goal being that of becoming homeowners, while battling against a relentless landlord intent on raising rent prices with every occasion. Oh, did you have a very large meal a few hours ago? Well, it is now time to go to the bathroom and do dice rolls for 3 business days in order to determine whether you are going to clog the toilet or not. Unfortunately, you have clogged the toilet, and the landlord is now knocking on your door inspecting the place. Finding the clogged toilet, he calls for a plumber to repair it, which ultimately ends up raising the price of your next rent. Unable to pay the rent, you suddenly find your entire family at your doorstep, which will proceed to beat you to death. Man, would you believe that so far we haven't even gone through a quarter of the rulebook? Seriously, this thing has around 1000 pages, and so far we are only approaching the 200th page. Look, I understand the point of all of this. The author obviously wanted to make this game as realistic and detailed as possible, but there is a point, and I believe that's when you start calculating a character's nipple length, or circumference, where you should start asking yourself, is this enough detail? But you didn't click on this video to hear me complain about this. Oh no, you clicked on it to hear what kind of other insane rules can be found within this rulebook. And for that, let me introduce you to magic. Like any fantasy roleplay game, magic plays a big part in this. I won't go into the rules as to how magic and casting works, otherwise we're going to be here for a few hours. I'll simply list a few spells that I personally found to be pretty wild, to say the least, and you, the viewer, will have to imagine in what kind of situations your character will ever find themselves in where you'd have to use such a spell. The first one in the list is pretty tame compared to the rest, and it's called Agelast, which will simply cause the targeted creature to lose its capacity to smile. Yep, no more comedy for you, dwarf. Time to be a miserable. Augment debauchery will cause an increase in debauchery of the targeted creature. Bestow aching back will cause the target to suffer from an aching back. And while you might think this will be potentially useful in combat, it isn't, as the rulebook clearly states that the pain from this backache does not translate meaningfully into game statistics, but it does annoy the targeted creature. Bestow Ingrown Nail will cause a creature targeted by it to suffer from an ingrown nail, which will be determined by another 3 business days of rolls. Funnily enough, this spell does affect a creature's statistics, as the creature with an ingrown fingernail will suffer a penalty of 3d10 when making skill checks that involve the use of that hand, while in the case of an ingrown toenail, they will suffer a reduction to their sprinting speed. Call God is a level 10 spell which, as the name suggests, will allow you to summon God. Defenestration is a level 1 spell which will cause a creature or object seen by the caster to be ejected out the nearest window. Fetching Charm for an unmanageable woman will require a lengthy ritual and will cause a demon to be summoned and fetch an unmanageable woman, bringing her to the caster. Upon arrival, she will be submissive and inflamed by passion. Force Swollen Balls will cause exactly that. Force Fart will cause a target to forcefully fart. And let's not forget about the spell force inferiority complex, which will cause a creature to, well, feel an inferiority complex. Seal orifice will allow the caster to seal a creature's orifice of their choice, which can only be reopened by cutting through the flesh. The caster's power will determine the thickness of the skin and flesh that will cover the orifice in question, such as your nostrils or mouth. And as for magical items, while you might have some rather normal ones, it is to be expected as to this game's fancy for a number of truly insane and unhinged ones. And I think that perhaps one of the most insane ones might actually be the Jar of, which I will refer to simply as the Jar from now on. So how does such a magical item work, you wonder? Well, I think the true challenge here will be attempting to describe its functionality without being demonetized by YouTube, but alas, I'm gonna try. So, whenever a male opens this jar, they must pass a drive sub-ability check at TH21, or be compelled to force their into the jar. Once inside, the jar will inexplicably grip it and make the person. When this is over, the jar user must roll a 1d100, and if the roll results in a 1 to 10, the jar will become pregnant. While in this state, the jar will not allow itself to be opened, but it can be heard screaming by others within 1d100 feet day and night. After 9 months, the jar will break, revealing a child inside. If the jar is broken before this, a twitching humanoid will appear from within and violently explode after 1d6 rounds, causing 1d4 sonic damage to everyone within 1d4 miles. When born, the baby will be unethically immoral, will serve its father loyally, will obsessively collect jars and appear male, but have no traits that will make him male, except for 2 oversized, which will cause him to feel forever frustrated, as he will never be able to. Any child of a jar will insist that others call them Chucky. Christ, honestly, if this video won't get age restricted, I'm going to be surprised. And now for the final part of magical effects, I would like to introduce you to the random magical effects table. Under certain conditions, random magical effects are possible. Sometimes these effects are the result of obscure or powerful magical items. Sometimes they result from an incorrect chant, ingredient, or ritual, while sometimes they are actively sought by experimental casters. Essentially, the rulebook contains 2000 random magical effects that might occur upon one of the situations I listed above. I will most definitely not go over every single one of them, but I will start listing a few for you hopeful amusement. I would also like to mention that many of these are in fact incredibly distasteful, and I will not list those, as there's quite a few that involve causing the caster or the victim to become, in fact, attracted to. Well, if you can think it, then it can happen, I assure you. But starting with the magical effect list, let's see some of those that aren't downright just completely disgusting. Starting with, caster grows an extra fully functioning eye on a random body part. Target becomes a loyal henchman of a random party member. Caster's entire living family appears in the battle. Caster's buttocks are caught on fire. Caster's eyes pop out but will be fully functional, and the caster will feel no pain regarding this condition. Caster screams "I'm blind" for 6 rounds. Caster must now skip instead of walking. Caster does cartwheels for 4 rounds. Caster is unbelievably happy and does not know why. Caster is starving for pudding. Nearest party member becomes alcoholic. Caster hops on 1 foot for 24 hours. Every rodent within a 1 mile of the caster will run to them and stare at them. Caster believes they must repair the nearest carriage. Caster vomits 96 times in a row, all within 2 minutes. Caster will attempt to kill on sight the nearest character they see who is cooking. The target creature is compelled to check their armpit for lice every hour while awake. From now on, every time the caster hears a baby cry, a tooth will fall out of their mouth. The casters can now think, speak and must eat to survive. Castor will produce a random gem once a day every time they go to the bathroom. Castor becomes schizophrenic. Castor is far beyond driven to steal undergarments and must do so once per day or lose 1 level point. Castor is forever unable to breathe unless their thumb is up there. Castor begins a dead dwarf collection. Castor is permanently unable to perceive women. Castor is ostracized by those about whom they care. And now, while we hopefully had a giggle at this, I think it's time to speak a bit more seriously regarding F.A.T.A.L. So, what is there to say about F.A.T.A.L? It is obvious that a lot of effort went into the creation of this game system. A lot of dedication, of research, of probably countless nights spent tweaking and adapting systems and mechanics to properly fit the game. And it shows. The attention to detail is fantastic. Unfortunately, all of the effort and dedication was applied in the wrong way. The constant racism, sexism, and controversial topics that the game is built around are probably the last thing one should be striving and dedicated to achieve. While F.A.T.A.L is completely self-aware of this fact, mentioning multiple times throughout its first pages that this game is recommended only to a mature audience and that sensitive subjects can and will be brought up, self-awareness doesn't make it better or excusable. In fact, it makes it even more so deranged. I believe that F.A.T.A.L had a certain potential as a game system, and I also believe that it is not its overcomplicated rules that were the problem in the first place. And the best example I can provide for this is probably Pathfinder, and I will provide a solid example by using the grappling mechanic. In Dungeons & Dragons, grappling an enemy is a special melee attack that uses a character's action to attempt to grapple a creature. The way it works is pretty simple. The grappler throws a dice, making an athletics check, which is contested by the grappled by making an athletics or acrobatics check. If the grappler's dice roll is higher, then he wins the contest. His targeted creature is now grappled and he can move them around as the enemy's speed is reduced to 0. Meanwhile, the rules for grappling in Pathfinder, well, I think are better expressed by consulting this chart. Yeah. And yet, Pathfinder was a pretty successful game, despite its overcomplicated rules. Critically acclaimed with a large community and fanbase, Pathfinder ended up even being an inspiration to many other games. F.A.T.A.L could have actually been fun to play if it wasn't just overwhelmingly sexist, racist, degenerate, and generally in bad taste. And yes, I do understand that F.A.T.A.L attempted to create a realistic experience, but people don't play games because they want a necessarily realistic experience. They want to have a fun one. Reality is already bad as it is, and many people play fantasy RPGs as a form of escapism, not to experience the worst parts possible about real life, in a highly ruled, convoluted setting. I couldn't even begin to start describing how uncomfortable it will be to even play F.A.T.A.L. Imagine you, yourself, sitting at a table with 4 or 5 of your friends, as the GM, or in F.A.T.A.L's case, the A.D.I.L, has to describe in detail an adult scene, and you, the player, has to respond to every detail as you both calculate and roll dice to determine stuff such as arousal levels and amount of load. This literally sounds like the most uncomfortable thing one could ever experience, and if you truly believe that this might be fun for you, I'm gonna be real, you honestly should check in with a therapist. While there is indeed an audience for everything, it is also true that the target audience for F.A.T.A.L is probably comprised of people who most likely wouldn't belong in a regular society and should be treated as outcasts. All in all, F.A.T.A.L definitely cements itself as possibly the worst fantasy role-playing game system ever made, and I doubt that a worse one will ever appear unless made with the sole intent of actually being worse than F.A.T.A.L. And yes, I am aware of the existence of Men, a manly RPG for manly men, but we're not talking about that. I truly believe that one was made simply as rage bait or as satire, in an attempt to perhaps emulate F.A.T.A.L, but like way worse. With this being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe to the channel. While I generally don't talk about board games or D&D, I might start doing so in the future. Currently this channel doesn't have a solid subject or direction it's heading towards. I'm still trying to decide what kind of content I like doing the most, but in general it tends towards me analyzing things and presenting them to you. In my own words, I do like making videos on subjects that become my latest hyper-obsession, and while it does sound weird to say out loud that F.A.T.A.L was indeed one of my latest hyper-obsessions, I feel blessed and I thank God that the reason it became so was because of how blatantly stupid I found it to be, not because I actually enjoyed it. As always, I'd like to thank this channel's members for supporting me. If you would like to join them, you can do so through the join button down below. I hope you have a good night, and I will see you in my next video. Bye bye.